In this video, I'm going to review the importance of communication, which is chapter 1. And to start, I want to ask you, how is it that we acquire information? Any kind of information, like information on what's a good movie, information on what's too much to pay for a hamburger, what's a good price to pay for a hamburger, what's too much to pay for parking. How do we learn that? How do we acquire information generally, just in our daily lives? So I thought of two ways. I thought of casually and formally. And by casually, I thought of overheard conversations, conversations had directly or indirectly. And so by that, I'll give you an example. Maybe you're standing in line at a movie theater and you're standing in line to see one movie, but you're overhearing a lot of people talk about a different movie that you really got to see. Maybe you weren't planning on seeing it, and maybe hearing so much of that talk really is influencing you to see that movie. Maybe they're talking about the movie you're about to see, and they're saying it's really bad. Do not even bother. Go to this other one instead. Those kinds of things are a way that we acquire information just by listening, or by the ability to listen and overhear conversations. Directly or indirectly, maybe you ask your neighbor or your friend what's a good shampoo, their hair seems to be looking better. But indirectly, maybe you overhear them mention it to someone. Hey, I'm using this new shampoo. I love it. And you go buy it. Um, Formally, something such as this, education, something we seek out, information we seek. Maybe you're looking for information specific to a specialist, specific to information you're seeking regarding a club you want to join, and so you actively seek it out. But the important thing to consider about how we acquire this information is in any example that I've given, communication is part of it. Communication and the ability to communicate is part of it. Not only that, but communication in a language that you understand is part of it, because I can overhear a conversation in a completely different language and not understand that they're talking about the movie I'm about to see and that maybe I shouldn't waste my time, right? So there's uh, communication is involved, but also language and the skill and the ability to understand and decode the message is a part of communication and a part of acquiring information. And so to further that example, how do you know like which gym to join? Did you ask your friends? Did you see a lot of your friends? Did you notice a lot of your friends joined one gym over another? Or is it because there's one near your house? Think about what maybe a beauty product that you really like. How did you even get turned on to it? And I have an example there of a car that has a bad reputation, but how about any brand that has a bad reputation? How did you hear about that? How did you acquire that knowledge? And so what this really reminds us is that we learn a lot from our environment. We learn a lot from our environment. Communication is a big part of it. The ability to communicate and understand communication is a big part of it. And this reminds us of information we learned in deaf culture, which is about how the deaf community acquires information and the fact that there is language deprivation and also a lack of information in their first language. And it also makes us think about our roles as interpreters. It reminds us the responsibility that we will hold when you all become interpreters. For those of you who are pursuing interpretation as your career, for those of you taking this class for other majors or other reasons, our class is about being professional communicators. And so we're really analyzing the role of the interpreter. And so if we think about acquiring information and how important communication is in that process, then we have to think about the importance of the job of the interpreter and why we have to understand it. Not just understand the job, but understand the role, but also understand the implications of doing the job correctly and ethically. And so it's a very complex process, and a lot of complexities behind the responsibilities that an interpreter holds, and really a big weight on someone's shoulders to hold that message and be able to render it faithfully. But remember, if you don't understand the message, how can you deliver it? And so there's the responsibility of listening, understanding, and delivering it clearly. That's a lot of work, right? And so interpreters are professional communicators. This is straight from your book. I love that statement, and I say it often. You are now in the field of being a professional communicator. So your book says it's really important that interpreters understand communication process as a whole and how messages are constructed. You have to understand messages, how they're coming through, the intention behind it, in order to deliver it properly. But then you also have to understand how to construct a message in the target language in order to deliver a clear interpretation. And because of this, you really should hold yourself to a high standard in the process of communication. You should hold yourself to a high standard as a person studying communication and as a person on their way to become a professional communicator. What do I mean by that? You should listen attentively, respond in a clear, concise manner, and try to follow directions. Because after all, what a conflict to be in the pursuit of being a professional communicator and not follow directions. That doesn't make sense. So your book goes on to say that good communicators learn to think analytically, they listen effectively, and they express themselves clearly. So again, it's not just about understanding the message clearly, it's about being able to express it clearly as well. And so a professional communicator is not just about understanding information, but it's about being able to express yourself, deliver information in a clear manner as well. So your book also says the communication process cannot be viewed as a linear process in which ideas flow one at a time in one direction. Information flowing in one direction and in a turn-taking manner is very rare. That doesn't often happen. Communication is usually interactive and dynamic, which means as a communicator, you are simultaneously sending and receiving multiple messages. How is this happening? Well, we're using environmental cues, body language, intonation, posture, etc. to deliver our message. And we're also watching environmental cues, we're watching body language, we're watching posture to gauge for understanding of our message and for gauging a response. So many nonverbal aspects of a message as you see there on the slide, facial expressions, gestures, body posture, vocal tones. They're all communicated unconsciously, meaning you can't help but sound like you're angry. You can't help but sound like you're annoyed. It just comes through in your communication because it's part of a natural communication process. We often have to work at not sounding like we're annoyed, or to work like not sounding like we're upset when we don't want that to be revealed, right? But really important, because those nonverbal elements of communication are what hold the bulk of the meaning. So in English, and this means in spoken language English, only 6% of the meaning of a message is found in words. That's big, and that's important. 39% of the meaning is in the vocal intonation. Like I just said, and that's important. I did facial expression. I did this secret, not so secret handshake, and I kind of emphasized in my voice. That's important. So for you listening, I hope that you understood, oh, I should be writing this down. This might be on a test, right? That's just an example. And if we look here, 55% of the message is conveyed in accompanying gestures, body language, and facial expression used. So it's really important what this is telling us. What this is telling us is it's not what you say, but how you say it. And likewise, for an interpretation, it's not what you sign or what vocabulary choices you choose, but it's how you render the message. So yes, vocabulary and words are important, but a bigger part of the meaning of that message is in the delivery. And so this is where we start to see the thinking and the processing behind interpreting choices. And so as we move forward with our class and our studies, think of how what we talk about and what we discuss influences an interpreter's choices. So when we do, when we watch interpreters, when we see what they're doing, when we have the ability to observe, what we're looking for is not what they say, but how they said it. And we're looking for what the person said in spoken language to see how the interpreter signed it in sign language and see the delivery. And we're looking for the meaning behind it, not a word for word translation, because as such, it's impossible. It's not a thing, right? There is no word for word correlation between ASL and English. And so your book goes on to discuss contextual environment as being part of the communication process and part of understanding communication. And what they mean by contextual environment is the physical location. Where is this communication happening? The status of the participant, their personal histories, and noise. And by noise, they don't mean sound, but in this context, it means anything that distracts the participants' interaction from their communication. So let's start with physical location. So if we think about a contextual environment, we can think of a school or office setting. In that physical environment, and that will lead us to the status of the participant, the professor, the teacher in a classroom, or the boss manager in the office has a higher status than a student, a visitor, or an employee in the office. And so that status influences how they communicate with each other. Think of a guest speaker in a classroom also. There's usually deference and respect given when a guest has been invited to an office setting or to a classroom setting. And that status of the participant um, is comes through in communication and how people interact with that person. Personal history influences communication. So if I get along really well with my boss, I might speak to them in a different way than I would speak to a new boss. I might speak to a student that I've known for some time in a different way than I would speak to a student I've never met. Still showing a degree of respect for a student. This is not to say the student doesn't deserve respect. It's just a different way of communicating. Still showing the degree of respect, but also showing a different kind of interaction and a different kind of comfort even. So me being a new professor to some of you, you may approach me in a different way than would a student who I've already had an experience with. That's natural, right? But for the same reason, if we connect that to interpreting choices, if someone is hesitant or wants to show deference and respect or doesn't have a personal history, that's going to come through in their communication, which has to come through in your interpretation. And so to noise, I want to make one comment as a side note is, well, first we'll touch on that anything that distracts the participants in the interaction can cause distraction, can influence the communication. But to tie that as a side note for interpreters, this is a reason that interpreters dress how they do, and they work really hard at trying not to stand out. Because the job is communication. The job is the message. The job is not to stand out and call attention to yourself. And so the interpreter wearing solid colors and trying not to be visually distracting is not just people say it's easy on the eyes, it's easier to watch, it's not distracting. Absolutely is not distracting. But it's also not trying to take away from this contextual environment or influence it in any way, and not trying to distract in any way or take attention from what's happening between the hearing and the deaf consumer, which is their interaction, their communication. We're just a third neutral party who happened to be there to facilitate that communication. Communication in action and as it's happening. Imprecise at best because of the human element. So there's no guarantee that the receiver will decode, understand the message in a way that matches the sender's intention. And just think about how many times this may have happened to you where you say something and you had no intention to offend someone, but you may have, or it came out the wrong way, or you were misunderstood and you had to kind of backtrack and restate things. It happens because there's no guarantee that your message will be understood. So effective communicators, their goal is to maintain or enhance a relationship. So unless the goal is directly to damage or break a relationship, the goal is to maintain it. And so we use a variety of styles that reflect our personality and personal values in our communication. And one thing I want to point out is, as it says there in the first bullet, communication in action is imprecise at best because of the human element, which naturally means that an interpretation is by nature not precise either. There is room for error. There's a big room for error. If communication is already imprecise between the communicators directly, you're now adding a third person who has to understand, decode that message. in a way that matches the sender's intention and try to deliver it in a way that the receiver can understand the message. Adding that third human element adds more room for error. And so don't ever think that your interpretation will ever be perfect. An interpreted message is always missing information. It will never be 100% right because of the nature of the human element that's been added, and because of the nature of receiving a message in a different language already changes the meaning because there is no exact translation for anything. So here's an example of how uh, communication can reflect personality and reflect personal values. It can come through in our expressions or in our language choices. So I'm going to give you a personal example so you can understand. So in my home, I guess that you can, you may or may not call that an expression, but that's what I use for an example for an expression. So I called my brother Nino at home. I don't call him by his first name because it's short for Padrino. He's the godfather to my daughter, but also almost all the nieces and nephews in our family. And so I call him that kind of to match everyone. Even though my she's an adult, she calls him Nino, I call him Nino. I call him Nino mostly when I'm among family. I sometimes call him that in text. Um, I call him that as a term of endearment and also to show his status in the family. So remember from our previous slide, the contextual environment. If I didn't call him that, I'm not showing his status in our family. However, if you see my second bullet there, in front of his coworkers or even his professional colleagues or someone who may not be, who our relationship might not be that intimate, and by intimate I mean close, I'll call him Isaiah's. And that is to show him respect. If I called him Nino in front of his coworkers, he might not take it well. It kind of depends on which coworker. Like it might be okay with his best buddy coworker, but not okay with his boss. And so as an act of respect, I don't call him that. That's important to consider in communication because think about then language choices and interpretation choices and how our environment influences what we choose to convey. So this is my personality and shows my personal values. I want to show the status of my brother in my family. I want to show him respect in front of his coworkers. This is how I choose to express it. It may not be how somebody else chooses to express it. For language choices in my home, whenever possible, we do not use the B word. I spell it out for you guys there. I just have this thing to avoid the language of scarcity, which means I don't like to say there isn't enough. I don't like to say I don't think this is possible. And I stop myself if I speak that way. I want to live in abundance. I do live in abundance. See, I just changed it right there. I live in abundance. And so it's just kind of a thing that we have. And so I choose my my words in that way. If somebody was interpreting for me and they used the B word, they would get me really wrong. And if I found out about it, I might be a little annoyed. So think about for yourselves what language you have. What are your expressions and language choices that reflect your personality and your values? At the end of this video, I will have prompted you for 3 different responses, and here is one of them. So the next thing that influences our communication is pragmatic rules, which helps us make sense of the language that we hear and the language that we're using. And pragmatics is a branch of linguistics that focuses on language and the context in which it is used. For example, and this is an example in your book, the phrase, "see you later." Your book gives us these three different phrases of what that, I'll say it again, three different meanings of what that one phrase can mean. See you later can mean, yeah, I hope I'll never see you again. Or see you later can mean we know where we're meeting, right? Or it could just, see you later means bye, I'm out of here. Never gonna see you again. So considering those three meanings, this is submission number 2. How would you sign the phrase see you later, but reflecting those three different meanings? So it means you're going to sign it 3 times, and your intention and your meaning are those 3 that you see on the screen. You're going to submit a video for that. So you're probably going to consider facial expression and body language in your delivery, right? Another part of communication is the speaker or signer goal, and I call it the intention behind communication, which is the why of the message construction. Why am I uttering this phrase to you? Why am I communicating this sentence or question? What's my why behind it? And a prerequisite of effective communication is to have a goal, a reason behind the statement being made. And for interpreters, understanding that goal, that reason, I like to call it that intention, is key to your interpretation choices. If you understand the speaker's intention behind their message, you can interpret more effectively. We just had the example of see you later. If you knew that the speaker meant when they said see you later means this meeting's over, bye. You might say, you might interpret, see you later, we're done. Um, or the other example of see you later meaning meet me at the corner where we had already agreed. You might interpret that see you later wink wink in a different way, right? So understanding the intention is really key to interpretation choices. And you might think, wait a minute, how am I supposed to understand the intention? Sometimes we get it wrong, but you will become a professional at reading people. You also are using environmental cues. You're using facial expression. I'm sure those of you who have had a chance to see interpreters work. You've seen them sometimes when the speaker says something a little off, turn around, like, did I get that right? They're looking at the facial expression. They're looking at the body language, and they're looking for those cues in order to ensure the correct delivery of their interpretation. So remember, as I just said, the interpreter is using the context to understand that intended message. The context of the message, the who and the where, will influence their interpretation choices. I'd like you to look at the chart on page 13 of your book, Powerful and Powerless Speech. And I want to make sure that you look at the chart and look at the pattern and the examples that it gives, and understand this. Language is absolutely powerful. And as your book says, it shapes and mirrors the perceptions of users. It reflects affiliation. It reflects attraction, interest, intellect, skill, ability, etc. If you think about how powerful language choices can be, think about the example of interpreting for a job interview and saying the right key words that match the job description, that match that skill and what they're looking for. Language can be incredibly powerful. And likewise, there is speech that can be completely powerless and completely discredit a person. So it's not just language choices that can be powerless, but it's also the delivery, the hesitation, the lack of confidence, hedging, uh, using vague words when a message should really be direct, um, thinking, processing. I see it as an interpreter sometimes processing on their hands or even on their face before delivering a message. And I really want you to consider powerful and powerless speech and the power behind it. Because as you move on to work as interpreters, this is going to become very important. And it's almost something that can get swept under the rug and nobody ever sees it except for another interpreter or except for another professional communicator. An interpreter lacking confidence can influence the perception of the person they're interpreting for as that person being the person who lacks confidence. So an interpreter having powerless language or choosing powerless language can influence the perception of a situation, can influence that job interview, can influence that communication between a boss and an employee, a professor and a student, a doctor and a patient, and influence it in a very negative way because the person with the powerless language and the person lacking confidence is actually the interpreter and not the deaf consumer or the hearing person. And the interpreter can actually influence the deaf person to perceive the hearing person to be the one lacking confidence, or vice versa, the hearing person to perceive the deaf person to be the one lacking confidence. This is really incredibly powerful if you think about it, because it may not be something that the interpreter is aware of or actively doing by using powerless speech. I hope it's not something that they're actively doing. But what I mean by this being so powerful is imagine how you've just influenced a situation or a setting by something that has all to do with you. That's huge. That's why we need to do a lot of self-analysis and self-reflection and know who we are before we set foot into an interpretation setting to be able to deliver that message between the two consumers, the hearing and the deaf, and not impose our own values or our own language choices and personality traits, etc., in that communication. I just gave you in a few slides ahead before my own values in my personal language and my own choices of how I communicate. I said I don't like to use the B word. But wait a minute. If a consumer signed broke, am I going to voice interpret it? Absolutely. Because that's not me. That's their word. And my job is to interpret for that person. If the hearing person said, I'm broke, am I going to interpret that to sign? Absolutely. Because that moment is not about me. And so I need to understand how to separate. I need to understand and do my own self-analysis This situation is not about me, and I could be very powerful in saying I choose not to use that word and not use it. Excuse me, that's what they said. Why am I choosing not to use it? So think about this, because there are some interpreters that have a hard time using sexual language, cursing, uh, whatever. I just had a problem with the B word. Someone else could have a problem with a different word. So there are interpreters that have a problem interpreting that and they don't include it. Is that fair? Is that a professional interpreter? Are they really doing their job if they're omitting part of the message? So we really need to understand where we are as, again, in our own values and understand our personality and understand how not to impose it and understand how in that moment we're for the communication. In that moment, I got to throw out my rules. My rules are out the window and I have to deliver my interpretation as faithful to the message as possible. Something for us all to think about. And I think that that's something we really need to reflect on is this powerful and powerless speech, because I have seen it. I have seen how we affect the situation, and some people miss it. They miss that it's happening because um, they're not professional communicators, but another interpreter will catch it. Absolutely, will definitely catch it. I would like you to ensure that you look at the various types of linguistic register in your book. I mean, I'm pointing you to the important parts in this lecture, but you really are responsible for all of the chapter. But I'm specifically saying these are really important in this lecture. And which is linguistic register, back to this, is the various types of register that influence an interpreter's vocabulary. It will influence your vocabulary choices. So remember the personal example I used of what I call my brother in a casual, intimate setting, family setting, versus maybe a work event. My vocabulary choices change. My intonation might change. My pacing might change. My posture might change. And so the register affects the interpretation choices. So it's important to know the various different registers in order to adjust and match. And the other thing that I've added here is that register can influence our professional dress. So the standard uh, dress for an interpreter is business casual. Um, Not typically a jacket and suit. Some interpreters tend to maybe just always wear a black jacket. Um, but there's a standard protocol for conferences should be a suit, and we should press conferences should be suits, but as we see, not everyone is wearing suits to that. Um, that's not a criticism. Those things are happening sometimes last minute and get called last minute, and so we can't always judge the interpreter who arrives without a suit. But if you see many try to, you'll see the press conferences that we see, the news briefings. It's just a standard practice that news briefings, conferences, things of that nature are a suit, typically a black suit, otherwise business casual, unless it's something completely recreational. Like there are things that happen that are going to be involve a hike or whatnot, and we'll talk about different places where you might work as an interpreter. But the point of this slide is that linguistic register influences your interpreting choices, but also your interpreting attire. So for chapter 2, which I'll be posting following this, is So for the next lecture, the influence on culture in communication, I have the third submission for this video, which is going to help us kind of introduce the next chapter. And well, here's the activity. This is not in your book, but I'll connect it to a part that is in your book. This is a separate part. The three facets of culture that was identified by Nitza Hidalgo, an educator, and she described the three facets of culture as you see on the slide: the concrete, the behavioral, and the symbolic. And what she said is that we all have in our culture three facets. We embody all of them. The concrete, which is something visible and tangible, like clothing, food, music, something we can see that's a big part of us. The behavioral is our language, our communication styles, gender roles, things like that. And the symbolic includes our values and beliefs, and this can often be abstract. These three things are what make up our culture. But one of them typically is what we identify with as the most, as um, the best way we feel that we identify ourselves. We identify more strongly in either the concrete part of our culture, or we identify ourselves more strongly in the behavioral part or the symbolic part. And so for you, I'd like you to think about and describe yourselves in the concrete, the behavioral, and the symbolic, and then choose which you feel describes you the best. And I'll show you mine. I'll show you the way I completed it. Here's my cultural list. So I've got the concrete, the behavioral, and the symbolic. And so for the concrete, I love Mexican food, and I like to make pozole from scratch. It's a recipe that my mom gave me, and I make it every year for the holidays, and it's just my thing. And I really love it, and I feel that I value it so much as a big part of my culture. For the behavioral, when I'm with my siblings or my friends, I speak English and I pepper it with Spanish. I think I text the same way with the same people, the same group of friends. I'm a first generation born in the US, and I feel I'm being vulnerable with you guys, but you guys don't have to be as revealing in your assignments. I feel like I have broken my traditional female middle child role, but it still haunts me. I'm still very like resistant to it. I feel like I'm still fighting it to this day. The symbolic, I was born and raised, I say Catholic with a Mexican flavor. Some of you will know what that means. I do have an altar in my home for loved ones who have passed, and in my culture, it's a big deal to respect people who have passed on. And I don't necessarily celebrate Day of the Dead. I know it's become very part of pop culture and embraced here. I don't celebrate it as a one-day thing. I I just have it all year round. Um, so it's interesting to me that it's become such a big thing now in the US, the Day of the Dead. It's kind of cool that we're now embracing and understanding more about it. But I don't celebrate it as a one day thing. It's just an everyday part of my home and my life. So give me 1 second. I'm trying to adjust it so you can see it. There it is. It's my last slide and it's a little wonky. Okay, so which do I feel defines me the most? They're all a part of me. But I feel that the one that defines me and describes me the most is the symbolic, which is to say the one you can't really see and the one you can't really know without knowing me personally, which means that it is important to me. If we go back to my example of not using the B word at home, you would never know that. You would never know that I don't want to use that word in my own language choices, not in my interpreting work. Which means if I was an interpreting client and you were interpreting for me, you'd have to understand me a little bit culturally and understand how I communicate, and you'd have to read me to be able to know that I'm deliberately trying to not say that word. And all of this will become important and will become clear as we move on to chapter 2, how culture influences communication and thereby influences interpretation. And it's not just the culture from our clients, but our own culture influences how we make interpreting choices. And it's our job to try to understand our part of it so that we can be more faithful to the message. And it doesn't mean set it aside or chuck it aside. It actually means to know myself more and value what I hold more so that I could understand the way I'm doing my job in a much more effective and clear way. And we'll learn more about that as we get into chapter 2. So for your submission, think about your own cultural list, your 3 facets of culture. Fill in something for each, the concrete, the behavioral, the symbolic. You don't have to be as deep as I was. I welcome it and I would love to learn who you are so we can learn from each other, but you can completely put something general and random. I just need to understand that you're following the lecture, but I'm not trying to get you to completely be vulnerable via video in an uncomfortable, awkward way. Just do what you feel comfortable with. But number 3, consider which level you identify as defining you more than the other. Now, we know that they all 3 apply, but we might feel one expresses ourselves stronger or defines us stronger compared to the other 2. I chose symbolic. What do you think for yourself? And so that concludes the lecture for chapter 1. This lecture included a total of 3 submissions. Number 1 and number 3 are a text or separate document submission, and number 2 are a video submission. Thanks.